McCuistion, talking about things that matter with people who care. Production of McCuistion is made possible in part by individual viewers. The Hatton W. Sumner's Foundation for the Study of Teaching and Self-Government. Hillcrest Foundation, founded by Mrs. W. W. Caruth Sr. CF & Company, LLP, serving Dallas-Fort Worth and the Southwest since 1956. And Sundown Ranch, providers of comprehensive and co-occurring disorder treatment to adolescents and young adults.
You know, this is part 2 of a 2-part series on the challenges to Western civilization, and specifically, we're going to talk about ways to overcome those challenges. Our guest is Herb Meyer, who outlined those 3 challenges as radical Islam, the liberal challenge from within, and demographics. He's back to tell us what we ought to do about them, so let's see what he has to say. And for those of you who didn't see the first program, let me say that Herb served in the Reagan administration as a special assistant to the director of the Central Intelligence Agency, vice chairman of the CIA's National Intelligence Council. And Herb, you were getting all kinds of intelligence passing over your desk all the time and trying to make some sense of it, I suppose. You were also widely credited with being the first senior government official to forecast the collapse of the Soviet Union. You were later awarded a U.S. National Intelligence Distinguished Service Medal for that. You were an associate editor at Fortune magazine, written several books, a DVD which is called The Siege of Western Civilization, and we're glad to have you here in Dallas out of Seattle.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Those 3 things that we talked about, tell us just briefly what you said about them, and then let's start going back the other way with this idea of this internal threat that you're talking about.
What we were saying in the last segment is that there are 3 concurrent threats to our civilization. One is the war itself. That's an external threat. We have the demographic threat, which we're causing ourselves. Our birth rates have dropped below the replacement level, which means our populations are in danger of shrinking or aging. And of course, you need massive immigration to overcome that, and that's another issue. And finally, we're in the middle of what people are calling a second civil war, what we call the culture wars in the United States. So we have 1 external threat and 2 kind of internal threats.
Okay. Now, let's take those in reverse order as we look at what needs to be done. And as we talk about this internal threat that has to do with civil war that you're talking, there's a term that is thrown about often. It's on college campuses everywhere. It's in the media all the time. It's called multiculturalism. Tell us what that is and what it means, and then differentiate that from what most of us think of when we think of multiculturalism.
Well, it's interesting. One thing I learned a long time ago, when people use a big fancy word, ask them to define it. There's a reason nobody defines multiculturalism. I got the definition. The technical definition is people of different faiths and cultures are permitted to settle without being required to integrate. That's the technical definition. It's got nothing to do with being sensitive to other people's cultures and all that stuff.
Or diversity.
Or diversity. It's got nothing to do with that. It simply means people are permitted to settle without being required to integrate. Now, traditionally in the United States, we've done a very good job of integrating our immigrants. That's how my family got here a couple of generations ago. I'll bet that's how most of your families got here. The approach was bring your food, bring your music, leave everything else in the old country, just be an American. The Europeans take a multicultural approach. Who are we to say that our way of doing things is any better than anyone else's? So to a great extent, the immigrants coming into Western Europe, they're mostly Muslim, are settling but not integrating, and that's part of the problem Europe's facing. Now what's happening in the United States is we're going down the European track. We're beginning to say it's okay to settle here, but you don't have to become an American. And that I find very worrisome.
Well, this is Cal Thomas, who's probably somebody you know or follow anyway, and he wrote an editorial last week. And it's talking about rising immigration poses a threat to England's future. And he says that large concentrations of Muslims in England are putting together what they call no-go zones. And that is that if you trespass in those neighborhoods, you risk being attacked. And this is being done and said by a guy who is a former Muslim who's converted to the Church of England's Bishop of Rochester. His name is Michael Nazir Ali. I don't know him. But in any event, what he's talking about there is this whole idea of segregation and subjugation of non-Muslims is the norm, he says, for this extremist form of Muslims. And in London, 1.3 million of the 7.5 million people living in London are Muslim. Does that have anything to do with the possibility that there could be differences there in how Western civilization is run?
Well, you have to be very careful here. There's a difference between immigration and settling in a country. Now, we have a very good history of bringing immigrants in, and in a couple of generations, the kids and grandkids, they're Americans. The Europeans don't have that kind of track record. So in Europe, the Muslims, to a great extent, are settling but not integrating. They've got what they call the no-go zones, where police won't go. With all the car burnings in France that brought Sarkozy to power, that's what that's about. To give you a sense of how separate they are culturally in Europe, today the fastest rising crime in Western Europe is a father killing his daughter. Now, by the way, that's now happening in Canada, and as of a couple of weeks or months ago, it's happening in Texas. There's a problem there. Now, when you come into the United States, we're not bringing in Muslims so much as Hispanics come in for obvious geographic reasons. By the way, most of them are perfectly wonderful. They're like everybody else's grandparents who came here 2 generations ago. They just want to get here, deal themselves into the game, and get the kids in school, and it's great. But increasingly, in our schools, we are preventing them from becoming Americans. We're sort of telling them to celebrate their diversity, their separateness, their differences, and I think that's a very bad thing.
Mm-hmm. What should be done about that in your estimation?
We have to make up our minds. Either our culture is worth defending or it isn't. And we seem to have lost that.
Well,
and that's a bad thing.
I know. I would say that there have been several Muslims who have said to me, in all seriousness, is that when you have a culture built around Paris Hilton, Britney Spears, Lindsay Lohan, and other sluts like that, you don't have much of a culture to defend, in my estimation.
And they're right. One of the problems with Western civilization is it's celebrity-driven and sometimes money-driven and all that. It's very ugly, and we're our own worst enemy in the sense that that is the face we show the rest of the world. And that's our fault, and we ought to get a grip on that. You know, all of us who are parents sort of understand that.
But it's not something
But it's a very bad thing.
It's not something you ask government to do, to censor stuff and all this. I mean, there's just a lot of things in this culture that most of us, I would say, most of the people watching this program are watching this program because they've taped Jerry Springer, and they'll watch him next. I don't know. I don't think that's the case. But you know, we've got that dumbing down, especially in the media. And as you said to me before the program, you said, I don't want to be on a program that just talks about sound bites. Can we talk about real thoughts here?
Look, it is a problem. We live in a society that is very complicated. Not just complicated technologically, it's complicated economically, socially, politically. It's modern society. We'd better understand it. Modern society, the United States, is like a 747. It's a marvelous piece of equipment, but you better know how to fly it. A lot of people are going to get hurt if you crash that thing. We'd better educate our children to understand. And one of the problems we've got, and this is part of the culture, we argue before we understand. And that's not a good thing. Sets a terrible example for our children.
Well, you look at the talk shows, if I may say, other than this one, obviously, but you look at the talk shows where everybody yells at each other all the time, on the phone, on the satellite, everything. I mean, I don't think any of them has a clue what they're talking about, number one. And secondly, they sure don't care what anybody else is talking about because they're just trying to get their sound bite in there. Am I missing something there or not?
The one thing, and I get on these talk shows from time to time, the one thing you will never hear from a talking head is, hey, you're right, I hadn't thought about that. I've changed my mind. Nobody backs off. Everyone's on transmit. No one's on receive.